Good evening and welcome to the Doylestown Bookshop's virtual event series. My name is Chrissy and I am thrilled to welcome authors Jance and Isabella Maldonado as they discuss Jay's new book, Credible Threat, and Isabella's book that will be released this fall, The Cipher. The authors will speak for about 30 minutes, then I will come back in to moderate the Q&A portion of the event. Please submit your questions by clicking on Ask a Question at the bottom of your screen and typing it in there. If you would like to purchase Credible Threat or pre-order the Cipher from the Doylestown Bookshop, please click the Buy the Books Here button on your screen. J.A. Jance is the New York Times bestselling author of the Ali Reynolds series, the J.P. Beaumont series, and the Joanna Bradley series, as well as 5 interrelated Southwestern thrillers featuring the Walker family. Born in South Dakota and brought up in Bisbee, Arizona, Jance lives with her husband in Seattle, Washington, and Tucson, Arizona. Isabella Maldonado is an award-winning author who wore a gun and badge in real life before writing crime fiction. A graduate of the FBI National Academy in Quantico, she spent 22 years on the force and is the author of the Detective Cruise series. I'm now going to turn this event over to the authors, and I'll see you at the Q&A.
Hello there. Hello there, everybody, and hello, Isabella.
Nice to be here with you.
The audience can't tell us, but we've been... Our tech connections work, so if we sound a little frazzled, that's our excuse.
Well, I think everyone wanted to hear you talk about all 4 series that you write, since it's so amazing that you actually have 4 completely different series. How did that happen?
Well, it happened because I have a short attention span. I could never be Sue Grafton because I couldn't set out to write 26 books about one character in a row without committing suicide. A little of my biographical background, I was born in South Dakota, but I grew up in Bisbee, Arizona. I wanted to be a writer from the time I was in 2nd grade. When I was in college at the University of Arizona, I tried to enroll in a creative writing program and was told by the creative writing professor, "You're a girl. Girls become teachers or nurses, boys become writers," and he wouldn't let me into his class. So I married a guy who was allowed in the class that was closed to me. He imitated Faulkner and Hemingway primarily by drinking too much and writing too little. He never had anything published, but that didn't keep him from telling me in 1968, "There's only going to be one writer in our family, and I'm it." As a consequence, I didn't actually sit down to write my first novel until after I was divorced and living in Seattle. So my first book, the first book that was never published, was 1,400 pages long, which is a good reason for it not to be published, but it taught me how to write. It was on-the-job training for writing. And when that book didn't sell, even with an author and even with being cut in, having an agent, and even after being cut in half, my agent suggested that I write something that was completely fiction. So I wrote the first Beaumont book. And Beau is a middle-aged Seattle homicide cop in that first book until proven guilty. He is a lifetime Seattle resident. His books are told in the first person through the eyes of this man, and I've never been a homicide cop, and I've never been a male, and I had only lived in Seattle for 2 years when I started writing them, so I had to do a lot of research to write the Beau books. Because the books are told in the first person, please excuse the roofers, they're here today, and they are pounding outside, and we'll just have to disregard it.
You can barely hear them.
I needed something for Beaumont to do when he wasn't at work. And so I had him do the kind of drinking that I had lived with for 18 years of my life. My first husband actually died of chronic alcoholism at age 42, a year and a half after I divorced him. So yes, if I had taken that creative writing program, I would have known that I should write. They would have told me to write what you know, but I was sort of smart enough to figure that out. So Beau did that kind of drinking. When the fourth book came out, a lady came to me at a book signing and she said, you know, Beau drinks every day. He has a drink of choice. It's starting to interfere with his work. Does J.P. Beaumont have a problem? And I said, you know, these are books. But it turned out that 6 other people asked me the same question, and I finally realized that invisibly to me, I really had written that into the book, and Beau did have a problem. So I made that discovery with book number 4. He's in treatment in book number 8, and Sins of the Fathers is Beaumont number 24. So there have been a lot more books with him sober than with him drinking. People sometimes tell me they preferred him when he was a drunk, and I worry about them. But I wrote 9 Beaumont books in a row, and then I was really tired of him, and when I told my editor I was going to knock him off, he said, oh, don't do that. Don't do that. You remember that first book you wrote, the one nobody ever bought? I did remember it because it was about an encounter my first husband and I had with a serial killer in Tucson in 1970. And he said, well, why don't you rework that book and we'll turn that into your first hardback? Well, okay, I had a contract for a book, I had a paycheck for a book, I had a deadline for a book, but I had a problem with the bad guy because the bad guy was then and still is to this day in the state prison in Florence, Arizona. And I didn't want to write a book about him. That year, I had such a bad case of writer's block. If you have to write a book and you don't have the bad guy, that is a writer's block inducing condition. So when my U of A alumni magazine came that year, I read the whole thing from cover to cover, and it said that the new creative writing program was just doing swimmingly. And I thought, well, I graduated from there. I've got all of these books out. I sold life insurance for 10 years. I'm not afraid of a cold call. So I called the director up. I told him who I was, what I did, and said, don't you want me to come be writer in residence for a semester in the sun? And he said, oh, we don't do anything with genre fiction here. We only do literary fiction. Well, it was a miracle. I was healed of writer's block on the spot. And the crazed killer in the first Walker family books turns out to be a former professor of creative writing from the University of Arizona. My first real experience with writerly revenge. But the other thing, when I wasn't allowed to take the creative writing program, I ended up getting first a teaching certificate, and then I got my master's degree in library science, and I spent 5 years as a K through 12 librarian on the Tohono O'odham Reservation west of Tucson. And so I loved those people. I loved what I learned there. I loved the stories and legends I learned there. So in writing the first Walker family book and the subsequent ones as well, I wove those stories and legends into the background of the book. The first one of those was Hour of the Hunter. So when I went back to writing Beau again, it was fun. So my editor said, well, why don't you come up with another character? I said, okay. Writing a first-person male protagonist is tough. Writing about an area I don't know very well is tough. Writing in the first person is tough. Why don't I punch the easy button? So I created Joanna Brady, who is set in Cochise County, where I know a lot. Uh, she's a female. I know about that. She's the last parent standing in her family. I know a lot about that. And her books are told in the third person, which is sort of fun. So for a number of years, I alternated Beaumont, Brady, Walker, Beaumont, Brady, Walker. But by the early 2000s, I was tired of all of them. So I was whining on the phone to my editor. She said, okay, here's an idea. Write a book. It can be a new character, old character, set it wherever you like, just to have it here by the 1st of January, and we'll publish it. Well, that was May. I can write a book between May and January. I've been doing it for years. So, signed a contract, got a paycheck, spent the paycheck, had a deadline. And then time started to pass. May passed, June, July passed, August, September passed. Suddenly it was October, and here I was with a book due in New York the 1st of January, and I had no idea who would be in it. Second really bad case of writer's block. At that point, when I had writer's block, I would compulsively watch the news. So on a Thursday in Tucson at noon, I watched the noon news, and my favorite news broadcaster, Patty Weiss, was on the air. Patty Weiss was 53 then. She had been working in Tucson news, TV news, since she was a student at the University of Arizona. So I watched her on the noon news. At 5 o'clock, I still had writer's block. I came on the air, so I turned on the TV for the 5 o'clock news, and Patty Weiss wasn't there. It turned out between the noon news and the 5 o'clock news, her 35-year-old news director came and told her that she was too old to be on TV and escorted her from the building. So here's the idea. It's a bad idea to make a mystery writer mad. And within minutes, I was writing about someone named Allie Reynolds being yanked off her news anchor desk in LA and coming home to Arizona, to her home in Arizona, to sort of pull her life back together. Credible threat is Allie Reynolds, number 15.
And I really enjoyed reading Credible Threat. It was just, it's an amazing story, and part of what makes it really interesting is how you really touch on some very hard-hitting issues that I think many other authors might have tried to stay away from, but you're fearless, and it's wonderful.
Well, as someone who was molested by a male relative when I was a child, sexual abuse of children and young people is something that is often, it's in my heart, so it's often in the background of many of my books, and that was certainly the case in Credible Threat. Here we have a woman whose her life and marriage, she's an ordinary woman, she's 71 years old, her life and her marriage have been devastated because she and her husband lost their only child to a drug overdose. But at the beginning of this book, she's sitting, minding her own business. Her husband they're kind of living as roommates right now because after their son died, their lives blew up. He lost his job. He was forced into early retirement. They have far less money in retirement than they expected. So their social life is constricted, their finances are constricted, and she's sitting out in the yard brooding, and her husband is in his garage making birdhouses. So she's minding her own business, and someone brings her a box of her deceased son's belongings. In that box, she finds his school yearbook. They love their son. They sent him to a private Catholic high school, a prep school, in hopes of him having a wonderful future. Instead, after he graduated, his life just fell apart. When she opens the yearbook, her son's yearbook, it falls open to a page featuring the swim team because her son was on the swim team. And she looks at the coach's face, and the coach, the coach, the father who was the coach, the priest who was the coach, his face has been completely blacked out, not only in that picture, but in every other picture in that yearbook. And Rachel Higgins suddenly realizes, she knew that that priest had been sent to prison for molesting some of his students. But until that afternoon, it never occurred to her that her beloved son had been one of his victims. And so she sets out on this path of vengeance. She wants to get even with somebody. The priest himself is dead, and so she hones in on the only handy target, which is the Archbishop Francis Gillespie of the Phoenix Archdiocese. Now, I didn't, characters are funny. Sometimes they show up and you expect they're going to be in one book and go away, and some of them just won't go away. And Archbishop Gillespie was one of those. He turned up in about book 4 or 5 of the Allie Reynolds series, and he's just sort of hung around on the periphery. He and Allie's husband, Bea Simpson, have turned out to be great friends. And when the Archbishop starts receiving threats in offering plates at churches all over his archdiocese, he goes to the Phoenix Police Department, to someone at Phoenix PD, and shows them the handwritten threats, and the guy says, "Oh, don't worry about it, you're a public person, it's just a troll, these threats are not credible." But the Archbishop is still worried about that, and so he takes his concerns to Allie Reynolds and Bea Simpson and their cybersecurity company, High Noon Enterprises. I knew very little about Archbishop Gillespie when I started writing this book. I knew he was from the Midwest. I knew he was from Chicago, but I didn't know any of the details of his life. I didn't know any of his childhood. And I knew him as this Archbishop guy, but the only way to learn about him was for me to write a book about him. And it wasn't until I wrote this book that I learned that Francis Gillespie was bullied by his older brother for years. And then finally, after spending the summer doing work on his grandparents' farm, he comes home, and the next time his older brother tries to bully him, Francis socks it to him. Yes, he was a good boy about turning the other cheek, but he reached a point where turning the cheek was no longer feasible. And it was really fun for me to realize that. But here we have Archbishop Gillespie being hunted by this woman who, over months, has turned herself into a very wily killer. And it's not a whodunit. It's more of a, will she be able to make it work?
Yeah, it's more the classic thriller. And yes, I will tell you, as a former law enforcement officer, she would have given me a run for my money trying to catch her. She's very wily.
She schooled herself by watching Forensic Files.
Okay.
Okay. Where else is a nice retired woman going to learn how to turn herself into a killer?
I was thinking about that when I was reading it. I'm like, she really is up on her forensics, and she knows how to cover her tracks. And I'm thinking, yeah, she'd be a nightmare for me to try to catch.
She was very careful about not leaving behind any DNA. She was really a careful opponent. And the other thing about this is Allie is sort of an amateur sleuth. I didn't think I could write amateur sleuths. I tried to make Joanna Brady be an amateur sleuth, and I ended up having to turn her into a cop. But I think Allie has turned into an amateur sleuth, and I think Agatha Christie would be proud of Allie Reynolds.
Yes.
Yes,
I agree.
I agree.
So, Isabella, I think I'd like the audience won't have a chance to read this book, but I just this week finished reading Isabella's new book, The Cipher, which, when is it due out?
November 1st.
November 1st.
And it was a real thriller. And what sometimes you get into a book and you feel like the author doesn't know what they're talking about. I read a book once where somebody in Phoenix met up with someone at the corner of First Avenue and Main. Well, the problem with that is the avenues and the streets run parallel. First Avenue and Central, and that's not possible because avenues are on the west side of Central and streets are on the east side of Central, and never the twain shall meet. They run parallel. And as soon as that error happened, I sort of lost interest in that book. But reading the FBI stuff in the Cipher, what I kept having take hold of me was, this is someone who's been there, done that, got the t-shirt. And I felt totally at home, not only with the story, but with accepting that you had adequate background for writing that terrifying book. It'll keep people up at night, trust me.
Yeah. It is kind of
scary.
I think, why don't we talk a minute about how the two of us met? That's kind of a happy circumstance. I live in Washington. I'm from Arizona originally, but you are living in Phoenix. And actually, here's a secret. Isabella Maldonado makes a cameo appearance as a character in Credible Threat.
I do. You have to watch for it when you read it. So it's funny that Judy and I, so we both have homes in the Arizona area, but we didn't meet until we were in New York City. Of all things, we had to be all the way on the other side of the country before we met.
And I was there. I was at Thriller Fest to be one of the speakers, and you were there to be one of the attendees. Mm-hmm. And we met in a very noisy bar, and just really hit it off. We've been friends ever since. Mm-hmm. The last time we were together was not this year at Tucson Festival of Books, because that didn't happen, but a year ago at Tucson Festival of Books. And it's really been fun.
Yeah, and we both share this love of Mexican food. There's an ongoing debate of whether you can find the best in Phoenix or Tucson. I had no idea until Judy got me the most delicious Mexican food in Tucson. It was truly amazing, and I was very impressed by it.
One of the things that I've been honored to do is, Isabella says that I've been her mentor. Well, that's not exactly true, because she's already a capable writer in her own right when we met. But when I was starting out, I had help from Jack Olson, the guy who wrote about the rapist in Spokane. The name of that street has just fallen, that area has just, South Hill Rapist. And Ann Rule, who wrote the book about the Stranger Beside Me, she wrote True Crime. Both of those true crime writers were really helpful to me as I was starting on the journey of becoming a writer. And so if I have been a help to Isabella, it's out of deference to those guys who helped me.
And she has really been a help. It's been the writing world it's in a state of flux right now. There's so much going on, and a lot of times different things happen in publishing, and I can always go to her and ask her, and I always value her opinions. And she has been gracious enough to share my work with her own fans, and I am incredibly grateful, because it's very hard to kind of get on people's radar when you're just starting out.
Well, yes, it is. You do one person at a time, one bookstore at a time, one signing at a time. And it does take decades. My first book was published in 1985, and 1995 was when it became apparent to me that my husband could retire, because whatever he earned was going to go to pay income taxes. So it only took 10 years or a couple of decades eventually to become an overnight success. But you have to have dogged determination. You have to ignore all the people who tell you no, it'll never happen, and you just have to go on anyway.
And I mean, like every writer, tells the same stories about how it's very difficult like that to just even, to get any kind of break at all. So it's just it's very much appreciated from someone like you. And I know we joked about this before. I'm now up to 4 hash marks on my sleeve. We joked about this one time before, that when you're in law enforcement, you get a stripe on your sleeve for every 4 years of service. And so I had 5 stripes or hash marks by the time I retired. Actually I had 22 years on, but I hadn't gotten to the 24th, so I only had 20 years worth of stripes. But anyway, and I feel like each book I write is another stripe on my sleeve that I can show that I've kind of been through the wars and I've experienced that. And so now I'm up to 4 stripes. For you, I can't. You've got how many stripes? How many stripes?
But I've been writing since 1980. I started writing in 1982. This is 2020, so it's decades now. The original Beaumont books are actually. They're actually historical fiction right now, because he's always looking for a dime and a payphone. And somebody wrote to me and said, well, why doesn't he just use his cell? And I said, look at the pub date. Cell phones didn't come online. They were, my husband, the retired electronics engineer, built the first cell phone for Motorola in Chicago in 1968, but they didn't actually go on sale until 1986. So the books are set in a world where there was no DNA, when the closest thing you could do to match a suspect to blood evidence was blood type. There was no way to tell to identify an individual hair. There was no DNA evidence. There was no automatic APHIS. There was no national database of fingerprints, no national database of DNA, and certainly no ever-present video surveillance. So his Beau's world of working in the mid-'80s is completely different from Allie Reynolds being able to work on solving a crime using Frigg, her pet artificial intelligence.
Everybody loves Frigg.
Yes, she's another accidental character. I expected her, she showed up in Man Overboard, and I thought she was a one-time character, but my editor said, and actually AI is a very dangerous topic. If we let AI run rampant, we're going to be in deep trouble. So my intention was to have Frigg dismantled and taken down at the end of Man Overboard. But my editor, somebody who is way less tech savvy than I am called me on the phone and said, "Oh, you can't kill Frigg." So 4 books later, Frigg is still hanging around.
And makes an appearance in this credible threat book. So someone has asked about one of your favorite subjects, Iors. Is the name that that Judy calls them. But someone's asking me if they should read my books in order. And for the first series, I do recommend reading them in order because there's like major character revelations in the Cruise series. And in the new series, that the first one will be coming out in November. So that's the good news. You can, if you pre-order the Cipher, you can be right in on the ground floor with that one. Now I know you like Iors, is what she calls them.
I'm sorry, ladies. I just lost power at my home.
Oh, wow.
And I had to hop onto my phone. So we're still here. We're still going. I just wanted to check in. So I'm going to pop back out while you all finish speaking. Okay. Sorry about that.
Can you hear Judy? Because I've lost her audio. I just want to make sure it's not a technical problem.
There we go.
There we go. There we go.
How are
She's
we
back.
doing
There
on
we go.
time?
She's back.
Okay. All right. Sorry about
We're
that.
good for time.
Sorry about that.
We're good for time. We're good for time.
Well,
Okay.
listen, Doylestown, Pennsylvania, had a tornado yesterday. No wonder she might be losing power off and on. So we'll just motor on. You know, for a minute, Isabella, I'd like to talk about my book of poetry.
Yes.
I said earlier that my first husband died of alcoholism a year and a half after I divorced him. But if you lose somebody to an addiction, or if you lose someone to a long-term chronic condition, what happens to the person involved in that, not the direct patient, but to the family members, is you become more and more isolated. And I had known about my husband's drinking before we ever married, but it wasn't, but he always told me, don't worry, when we have kids, I'll quit. And actually, I believed him, because his father went away to World War II drunk and came back sober and never had another drop. So I thought, like father, like son, we're good. But shortly after we married, I began to see that things were a lot more difficult than I expected. And while we were teaching on the reservation, we were living 30 miles from town in either direction, 2 miles off the highway, 7 miles to the nearest neighbor and/or telephone, and in the evenings he'd be passed out cold in his recliner by 6:30, 7 o'clock at night. And there I was on the hill by myself, and he had told me there was only going to be one writer in our family, and it wasn't me, so I knew I wasn't supposed to be writing. But that's the thing about writers. Writers write no matter what. So I would sit at the dining room table and I would jot off these little pieces of poetry. And I thought I was being true to my art. Between 1972, when my daughter was born, and 1980, he was hospitalized 9 times for chronic alcoholism. And the whole time, every once in a while, I'd sit down and jot off another poem. In 1980, he showed up at my 6-year-old son's t-ball game, so drunk that when the game was over, he crawled on his hands and knees from the bleachers back to the car. And it was during that walk with my kids, their friends' parents, with my husband crawling on his hands and knees, that I finally realized if 18 years of loving him hadn't fixed him, I had to save my children and save myself. Well, I was in Phoenix. I was selling life insurance. And I was wrestling with the idea of whether or not I should divorce him. I worried the idea that I might actually be able to live my dream and become a writer wasn't even on the radar. I was worried about keeping a roof over our heads and food on the table. I divorced him, and then I realized that I was still susceptible. And if I stayed in town and he asked me to take him back, I would. So I loaded the kids in a U-Haul trailer, or I loaded our possessions in the U-Haul trailer. I kept the kids in the car. And we did an adventure of moving from Phoenix to Seattle. And this is, emotionally, this is where I was as we were making that drive. I only cried when the kids were asleep because I didn't want them to know how scared I was. But this is where I was. I have touched the fire. It burned me, but I knew I lived. It seared me, but it made me whole. He called me. I went gladly, though I saw the rocks, fell laughing through the singeing air. I have known the fire. I'll live with nothing rather than with less. The flame is out. There's nothing left but ash. Came to Seattle. I started writing in 1982. At Thanksgiving of 1982, my husband was living in Phoenix. He had been working construction. And in May, he broke his wrist on the job, covered by workman's comp. So he had money coming in. He was living in a house that had belonged to his grandmother. By then it belonged to his mother. So he was living there, didn't have to pay rent, didn't have to pay utilities. So he drank from May to November. Now, while we were married, when my daughter was born, he took me to the hospital and dropped me off. And then, when he came to get us from the hospital 3 days later, he had been on a 3-day bender. And when we got home, I said, okay, you said when we had kids, you'd sober up, here's the kid, it's time. So he dumped his booze down the kitchen sink, and we lived through 3 days of DTs. 3 days of not being able to turn off the lights because of the bugs crawling on him. 3 days of him playing chess at the dining room table with people I couldn't see. It was just nuts, but I thought, okay, he's keeping his promise. I can do this. But 3 weeks later, some of his pals showed up and handed him a beer. He popped the lid off it, and we were off and running again. In November of 1982, just before Thanksgiving, his mother, married grandma, called him and said, I just scored a last-minute ticket to Phoenix, and I'm coming down so we can spend Thanksgiving dinner have Thanksgiving dinner together. Without paying any attention to how much he had been drinking or for how long. In honor of his mother's visit, he decided to go off booze. They had dinner Thanksgiving night. At midnight, a Tempe cop found him lying in the street. They thought at first that he was the victim of a hit and run, but when they got into the hospital, he had no kidney or liver function. He had gone into DTs. So Mary Grandma, his mother, had only a 7th grade education. She was there with her son, but the doctors were just walking all over her. And she finally called me up and she said, would you please call and talk to the doctors and see if you can get them to give you a straight answer? Well, at that point, we had been divorced for a long time. So here's how the phone call went. He's dying. Words come through the wire and hammer home, despite the doctor's cloying, unctuous tone. He's dying. I thought my tears exhausted years ago, but yet it hurts. Oh God, how much it hurts. He's dying. This is what I wanted when I thought a widow's garb would suit me better than a court's decree. He's dying. Should I go to him or stay away? What right have I to be there now? He's dying. I'll go. So I flew to Phoenix, and I spent several days with him and with her. On New Year's Eve, I took her out to dinner, married Grandma out to dinner. I divorced her son. I never divorced my mother-in-law. When we came back from dinner, about 7:30, this is what happened. It's called vigil. We keep a vigil by his midnight bed, his mother and his former wife, grieving for the man we loved and lost. It's harder for his mother than for me. I've already known the sting of loss. She's only now begun to see she cannot win. He's quiet now. A nurse comes in to loosen his restraints, not looking at the women waiting there. She knows. She doesn't want to say. These hours creep by. All stores are expended, yet we need some sound to hold the night at bay. Please sing, his mother asks me, and I do. It is a serenade of love, of songs we knew and treasured through the years, from bawdy barroom ditties to sweet hymns. The hours flow by. We hold his hands. I sing a line and wait to see if he will breathe again. He doesn't. It's over. Amen. And this, when you're divorced and your spouse dies, there is no handbook to tell you how you should behave or what you should feel or what you should do. And this is called death after divorce. I come to widow's weeds unwed, the tie that binds unraveled but still bound. I sang a song to speed him on his way and hoped he gained some comfort in the sound. My love renewed in those brief final hours, all rancor gone, all bitterness and grief. And as I touched his cheek or soothed his brow, we wrote the final chapter of our breach. And as his painful struggle neared its end, when ragged breath gave way to endless sleep, we welcomed death together, he and I, for granting us the blessing of release. After the Fire is my autobiography in poetry and prose. It's the story of that journey. And all those years when I was writing poetry, I was hiding it away in the strongbox. Then in February, after he died, I had to get out the birth certificates and marriage certificate, divorce decree. And there were all these pieces of poetry. And reading through them, it was like seeing my life in instant replay. I hadn't been being true to my art. I had been being a writer and using words to deal with the central issue of my life. The emails I receive from people who have found that book when they've been in the throes of losing a spouse. One woman encountered after the fire while she was losing her husband to dementia, and she has told me that that book was a guiding light to her through those very dark days. I consider After the Fire to be an all-occasion greeting card for bad occasions.
It's so heartfelt, and it's so beautiful, and I think it's timeless and touches everyone's heart.
So I do not have a watch. I'm assuming that we're running into our Q&A. Is it time for Q&A?
Yeah, we are.
Hey, Christy?
Yes,
yeah, it's time.
Yes,
it's time.
It's time.
It's time.
Luckily, I have a little light here, so we can do this. Okay.
So do we have questions?
Oh my goodness.
We do have some questions. I'm gonna read them to you, and then you can answer. Okay. Bear with me. Okay. Does Patty Weiss know that she was the inspiration for your Allie Reynolds book?
Yes, Patty Weiss knows that. I made sure she heard that.
Okay.
I believe she's living in Ohio these days.
Oh. And while fans love to meet their favorite authors, the state of the world has made video conferencing such an ideal alternative. When I met you, Miss Jance, you were hustling between long distances, which, as for Joanna's husband, can be grueling. Will you be reconsidering how you interface with fans and consider doing more video conferences?
Well, video conferences sound easier, except when they don't. I really am, when you have technical issues that are unresolvable, it's enough to drive you totally nuts. I actually really enjoy speaking to live audiences. And so the idea of speaking into a camera is actually terrifying to me. I've gotten more accustomed to it with practice. But I really love having the chance to be with in the same room with my readers and being able to hear from them what my stories means to the people who are on the other side of the page. I, I, my husband would like me to act my age and stay home and be a good virtual author girl, but I don't know. I still will miss. I really miss being on the road, and I really miss the fan interaction of the Tucson Festival of Books, and I'm hoping that that will be back this coming spring.
All right. And do you still write poetry now?
You know, I haven't written poetry for a very long time. I'm too busy writing prose to write poetry. When I was writing that, it was my only writerly outlet, and so I'm so busy right now with all of my characters, and each of them demanding a certain amount of attention and time, that I haven't written poetry for a long time.
Is that beautiful mural behind you an image of Bisbee?
Actually, no. It is Tuscany. I don't know if I can show the whole thing. This is a Michael Coleman. M.L. Coleman is a Sedona area writer, and his wife was a fan of mine, and we met him. And so our home, our home in Tucson and our home here were both filled with Michael Coleman paintings. Can you see the ones here?
Yes.
When we brought them home from Tucson, we took paintings from one 4,000 square foot house and tried to squeeze them into two houses worth of art into one house worth of art. This is the Formula One race in Austin. Can you see it? I can't see what I'm showing.
Yes.
And this is the first Michael Coleman we bought. So the only way to get all of the art into our house was to stack it. And when my 14-year-old grandson came to the house, he looked around and he said, "Grandma, it looks like an art gallery exploded in your house." But this, at Christmas time, we usually put our creche on the credenza behind me. And as far as I'm concerned, this is actually Bethlehem in the background. I know it's Tuscany, but I write fiction. I can pretend.
Okay, and there's a question for Isabella. I could only find that Cipher will be an audible release soon. Your books available somewhere in audio format?
Yeah, now unfortunately, I'm afraid the question you skipped out a little bit, something about Audible.
Oh, it says she could only find Cipher as an Audible release soon. And I said, oh, that
Oh,
might be because it's coming out in the fall.
yeah, it's going to be, it'll be available in Audible. It'll also be in paperback. It'll be in stores like Barnes and Noble. And if you like to get the CD version, you can get those. You can either order them from Amazon or you can get them in Barnes and Nobles, or they'll have them in bookstores, Doylestown Books, perhaps.
Yes,
Um,
if you click the link on your screen that says buy the
yeah.
books here, you can actually pre-order that book if you would like to.
Exactly. So it'll be available in all kinds of places, no matter where you live, even if you aren't lucky enough to live in Pennsylvania, where you're real close to Doylestown, where you can head over there. You can get it in a variety of different places.
Okay. All right. And for JA.
Actually,
Oh, go ahead.
I think Judy's saying something.
Oh, okay. There we go.
Okay. There we go. Get her.
Listening to the music, I was struggling, trying to figure out if I could survive if I got a divorce. And so on those drives, I would listen to the music of Gordon Lightfoot, cobwebs and dust, I hate to leave you, but leave you I must. And Helen Reddy, I am woman, hear me roar in numbers too big to ignore. And then there was the music of Janice Ian. Her lyrics pierced me to the heart, and one of her songs especially, at 17, felt like my life because I was 6 feet tall in 7th grade. I wore thick glasses. I was smart. And all of those three things taken together is a sure recipe for social disaster in junior high and high school. So when I heard her song at 17, I thought, boy, she and I have walked in the same moccasins. Well, you can't tell this from here, but I'm 6'1". And when I found out she's only 4'10", the moccasin thing just wasn't going to work. But for years, when I did public presentations, I would close by singing that song because it meant so very much to me. In 2008, in June of 2008, I had agreed to speak at a writers' conference in Boise, Idaho. Then, the weekend I was supposed to be the keynote speaker at the writers' conference, my husband's bilateral knee replacement surgery, which was supposed to happen in August, got moved up. So he was going to be going from the hospital to rehab when I was going to be in Boise. And I told my daughters, oh, I'm just going to call the writers' conference. I'm going to tell them, my husband's in the hospital and I can't come. And they said, Mom, you gave your word. We'll take care of Dad. You go keep your promise. Doesn't it just annoy you when your kids start spouting back all of the lessons you carefully taught them?
Yes.
So, muttering under my breath, I headed for Boise. I did my keynote speech at noon on Saturday. Sunday night, when I got back home to Seattle, I opened my computer, and there was an email from Janice Ian. She said, hey, I heard you sang my song in Boise on Saturday, and that you did a good job. Turned out that somebody at the writers' conference was a fan of my books and a fan of Janice Ian's work, and she had gone straight back to Nashville and tattled on me, which is how Janice Ian and I met and became friends. A couple of years ago in Tampa, we actually appeared together and sang Janice Ian's iconic song together as a duet, but that wasn't easy because Janice still has her full vocal range, and she said, Judy, you sing in the key of R. So here, in the key of R, is Janice Ian's song. I learned the truth at 17, that love was meant for beauty queens, and high school girls with clear-skinned smiles who married young and then retired. The Valentines I never knew, the Friday night charades of youth were spent on ones more beautiful. At 17, I learned the truth. And those of us with ravaged faces, lacking in the social graces, desperately remained at home, inventing lovers on the phone who call to say, come dance with me, and murmur vague obscenities at ugly girls like me. At 17, a brown-eyed girl in hand-me-downs whose name I never could pronounce said, pity please the ones who serve, they only get what they deserve. The rich relation hometown queen marries into what she needs with a guarantee of company, haven for the elderly. Remember those who win the game lose the love they sought to gain in debentures of quality and dubious integrity. The small town eyes will gape at you in dull surprise when payment due exceeds accounts received. At 17, for those of us who learn the shame of Valentines that never came, for those whose names were never called when choosing sides for basketball. We all play the game, and when we dare, we cheat ourselves at solitaire, inventing lovers on the phone, repenting other lives unknown, who called to say, come dance with me, and murmur vague obscenities at ugly girls like me. At 17, it was long ago and far away. The world was younger than today, and dreams were all they gave for free to ugly duckling girls like me. And it's thanks to my readers that my dreams have all come true.
Oh my goodness. Well, I think this is the first virtual event where I've almost cried. Thank you both. Oh my gosh, no power and I'm crying. Thank you both so much for being with us tonight. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, but we made it. If you would like to purchase a copy of Credible Threat or pre-order Cipher, please click the button on your screen that says buy the books here. Thank you again to the authors. It was nice to meet you both virtually.
Bye-bye.
It's very nice.
Have a good night.
Have a good night. Say good night to everyone.
Say good night to everyone.
Take care.
Take care.